Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Aquaculture Webinar Series. This series is brought to you by the National Aquaculture Association, North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the United States Aquaculture Society, and is designed to enhance aquaculture production and educational opportunities throughout the United States. Today's webinar is entitled Aquaculture Business Planning and will be presented by Matt Parker, Aquaculture Business Specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. Matt has more than 20 years of experience with aquaculture in the southeastern U.S., working on marketing and economic issues related to a variety of aquaculture businesses. He focuses on striped bass, crawfish, and more recently, oysters. Matt has spent the majority of his career educating aquaculture producers about the needs for proper business planning and assisting them with writing business plans and finding financing. Matt's goal is to advance the U.S. aquaculture industry by helping producers develop financially stable businesses with realistic financial expectations. Thank you for being with us today, Matt. Take it away.
I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and joining us today for our aquaculture business planning webinar. From the registrations, I see we have a wide variety of people, from industry participants to NGOs to government folks to extension to interested parties, as well as a wide range of people with experience and production levels, and lots of different species represented. Here in Maryland, we tend to focus mostly on oyster aquaculture. So most of my examples and pictures will be from, we'll have oyster aquaculture phrases and examples in them, but you can use the principles for any species. So if I'm talking about an aquaculture lease, that could also be a tank and a tank system, or it could be a pond and a pond system, or a line and a long line system. So the principles will be the same no matter what species. Just substitute whatever species you're interested in as aquaculture, or excuse me, as oysters. So aquaculture takes many forms, especially when it comes to oyster aquaculture. You may have a remote tank operation, you may have cages somewhere, you may have floats, they might be bottom cages, just like you might have ponds or recirculating systems or aquaponic systems or cages and floats in pond to fee fishing operations. It could be anything that's growing in the aquatic environment, and the principles behind the aquaculture business planning will be the same no matter what you're growing. So what we'd like to talk about today, or things that we generally have available, are we're going to talk a little bit about the business of aquaculture and the impacts on what impacts farm profitability. A little bit about some types of financial tools that are available. I'll touch on the business plan some. If we have enough people that indicate they would really like a focused how to do a business plan webinar sometime, we can put one of those together in the future, but I thought I'd keep it fairly brief or fairly general to go over to keep everyone kind of involved. And then if you're interested in shellfish production, we have some spreadsheets available from the University of Maryland to help analyze your business. And there are others around that I could point you to for other species, for finfish or recirculating systems. So your business plan, you start off with a lot of questions. You want to know if something's going to work, what happens if it doesn't. So your business plan is going to have all types of information in it. A lot of this information, you've got it in your head already. It's just taking it and putting it down on paper. And a lot of people feel intimidated by putting it on paper, but I tell them all the time, it's all in your head. You just got to write it down. And once you write it down, there are people and resources available that can help you organize it into something a little bit more formal. But if you're trying to get me to help you with it, if it's all in your head and you don't put it down, then I have a hard time helping people with getting their business plan written and put together. So first, we'll talk about the business of aquaculture and impacts on farm profitability. So the first thing is you need to start thinking about aquaculture as a business. You know, raising fish, raising plants, raising oysters, that tends to be the easy part. Running the business is what tends to be the hard part, making the money work to achieve the financial outcome that you would like. Lots of times this has to do with having really good records. I've Every presentation I've given, I mention record keeping because everyone could do a little bit better job with record keeping. We're going to talk about the cost associated with aquaculture production, a little bit about sales and marketing, and then at the end, like I said, we'll have time for questions. As long as you put them into the Q&A box, I can kind of go through them and answer them as we go, or at the end. So thinking about aquaculture as a business. One of the first things you need to do is to set your goals. If you don't know where you're trying to get to, then it's really hard to develop that plan to reach your goals. So we'll talk about goals in just a second. So you set your goals, you write your plan to reach your goals, you put that plan in action, and your business plan should be a living document where it doesn't just sit on the shelf forever after you've written it and you never look at it again. You should pull it out periodically and evaluate how your business is doing compared to how you thought it would do. And then if you need to adjust your plan to make those goals, to meet your goals, then that's what you do. So this should happen probably at least once a year. Sit down and evaluate your business to see whether or not you've met your goal, your financial goal, your production goal, your expansion goal, anything you want to do. It's kind of like going on a trip. I use Waze a lot. If I don't pay attention to what Waze is going to tell me on my phone and the directions from the GPS, I miss the turn and I end up somewhere where I did not intend to go. Usually that's not a big deal, but in your business, it could be the difference between a profitable business and going out of business and losing a lot of money. So goals. A good way to think about your goals is to try to have SMART goals. So SMART goals are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and there's some sort of timeline involved. So specific goals could be something along the lines of you want to increase your profit, decrease your production costs, you want to increase your production, you want to expand. It needs to be measurable. How much of a change do you want to see? So this might be, I want to increase my production by 10% in the next year. I want to increase my profit by $50,000 in the next 5 years. And if you don't have a way to measure it, you won't be able to figure out how far you are along in trying to achieve those goals. And they must be realistic and achievable. If you come to me and you say, I would like to make $1 million in aquaculture in the first year, that's probably not going to be realistic and not really going to be achievable unless you have some special something that nobody's ever heard of and they don't know they want until they see it. So it needs to be achievable. Improving by 200% probably isn't realistic either. It also needs to be a relevant goal. Is this the right economy for this type of goal? Say you want to expand, you need to borrow money, but interest rates are through the roof, 19, 20% from the bank. It might not be the right time to borrow money to expand your operation. Or is the goal too large? It's kind of like relates back to achievable. Do you want to go from 100 acres of catfish to 1,000 acres of catfish in the next year? It's just probably not relevant or achievable or probably worthwhile. And then finally, timeline. How long does it take to do it? It might be a week. It might be a month. It might be 1 year. It might be 10 years. It just really depends on what your goal is and how complex it is. For example, if you had a investment of $5 million into a giant aquaculture venture, getting that $5 million investment back in the next 1 year might not be relevant or achievable. However, if you want to do it in 10 or 15 years, depending on what you're growing, that could might be achievable and relevant. But you've got that goal that you can measure and you can see what's going on. So now we have to develop a plan to reach our goals, and this is your business plan. You gather information about your business, and that's going to be production information, financial information, marketing information. You want to evaluate the current state of your business, and looking at different financial positions or financial ratios is a good indicator. If you're not in business yet, the current state of your business is nothing. So you want to try to forecast out where your business might be in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years, and so on. And then you determine what steps it might take you to reach your goal of getting your business started, or continuing operations, or increasing your profit, or getting to a break-even price, any of those things. And then if you're already in business and you're wanting to make some changes, such as expansion, estimate the benefits of the changes versus the cost of implementing those changes. So if you are raising, let's say, oysters, and you want to switch to mussels, the cost might not be that big of an impediment to implement that change, and you might get some benefit. But let's say if you could, there's a new piece of technology out there, and it's going to cost you $100,000 to implement this new greatest whiz-bang piece of technology, but it only lowers your cost of production by 1 penny. That probably might not be the benefit to justify the cost of that type of technology or change to your business. So then you're going to take all this information and you're going to write your business plan. So all that information, your production information, your marketing information, your financial information, is all compiled into that business plan, and it gives you a map of where you'd like to go. And if you're already in business or you've been evaluating your business from going for a while, it can show you where you've been and what changes you've had to make. And your business plan will help you and others, such as financial institutions, understand your business, your goals, and what you want to do. There's very few of us who are independently wealthy who go into starting aquaculture businesses. Most people have to take out some sort of loan at some time, and in order to do that, your financial institution wants to see a plan. And they're not going to go in, let you sit down and just tell them what you want to do and say, give me $100,000. They're going to want to see a plan to use that, and so they can evaluate to see when they'll get paid back. So all that type of information will go into your business plan. Generally, you'll start with a executive summary, just a 1-pager, 1.5-pager, and then you'll go through all the important information down to the nitty-gritty details of what your business is going to grow, how it's going to grow it, where you're going to sell it, who you're going to sell it to, who's going to help you do it, employees that you have, and your past financial information if you've already been in business, or any pro forma or expected or forecasted financial information. So let's fast forward, and we've got our business going for a while. Now we're going to evaluate our business. As I said, this could be done weekly, monthly, seasonally, or annually. It really depends on your markets and your production schedule. So if you're in the southern U.S. or in Kentucky and you're raising macrobrachium and you have a short production season, you can do it a couple at the end of the season. If you're growing oysters that take 3 to 4 years to reach a market size, you'd want to take a look at it annually, but also, it's a long time for that crop to reach maturity for you to figure out exactly how things are going. So it would depend on your markets and your production schedule. I would recommend at least a yearly business evaluation. You have to file taxes every year, so it's a good time to sit down with your accountant and go over everything at least once a year. That way you'll kind of know what's going on and where you're sitting. And I highly recommend having a tax accountant or someone like that to help you with some of these things as you go forward. As you're evaluating your business, determine which goals you've met, which ones you did not meet, and whether they're still relevant, and figure out why you didn't reach them and how you're going to proceed for the next time period. After you've evaluated the success of your plan or the failure of your plan, as the case may be, you can figure out what you need to do to reach the goals you did not meet. So, a hurricane came through and wiped out everything. Well, there's not a lot you can do about a hurricane, but you can kind of make plans to deal with your financial institutions or your partners, or decide if you want to continue the business, those types of things. And if you've met all your goals, set some new goals. Try to get bigger, try to get more efficient production, try to lower your production costs, expand your operation if everything's going that great, and update your business plan to reflect these new changes and goals. So like I said before, your business plan is a dynamic document that provides you guidance for your operations while being always open to modification and improvement. Don't write it, get your money from the bank or whoever, throw it on the shelf and never open it again. That's just not a good business practice. I'm sure there have been some folks that have gone on to be wildly successful in business or aquaculture or some other field that never wrote a business plan, but I bet that they would have done a little bit better or had a little bit better idea what was going on if they would have written one in the past. So our next topic that we'll cover that will really help you with your business planning is record keeping. So why do you want to keep records? Well, it helps you learn from past experiences. It can help you predict future production. It can help you determine the cost of production and calculate break-even prices, which helps you know if you're making money or you're losing money. It can help you obtain financing, figure out future sales, and helps you evaluate the success of your aqua farm. I did an internship on a striped bass farm when I was in graduate school, and the owner told me, we really thought we would remember where we put all those electrical lines that we buried to our tanks. But you know what? After 20 years, they had forgotten where all those electrical lines were. So, if you had to dig up anything, you had to shut the power down to that particular section of outdoor tanks. You had to make sure when you were digging, you didn't hit any lines. If you did, you fixed them. You had to make sure the fish were ready so that they weren't going to die and the weather wasn't bad. So keeping records can be a really good and helpful thing. So what types of records can we keep? Well, we can keep production records, which could be a daily harvest, a seasonal harvest, a monthly harvest, whatever your production schedule is. And then financial records. So sales, your cost of supplies, labor, equipment purchases, loan payments, tax payments. We did a workshop in Maryland last night about tax management and had an accountant talk. And I've learned there is no shortage to the amount of record keeping you can do to help keep you covered for anything in the future that you can do. So the more records you can provide those professionals to assist you, the better off you'll be. So you might have daily records. So if you're for your shellfish farm or your ponds or your tanks, you might be collecting water quality data, especially in the hot summer time in ponds. What's the oxygen, what's the temperature, what's the weather like, how things have been going. Anytime you harvest, you should write it down so that you'll know what is in your pond or on your lease or in your cages. These harvest and daily records can be used to help determine your production costs. Seasonal records, so like chronological records of what goes into your farm and what comes out of your farm. Um, Seed, fingerlings, shell, harvest, mortality is a big one. If you don't write down that everything has died, if you had a problem, or don't quantify it in some way, you could end up wasting a lot of money by feeding an empty pond or overfeeding a pond and causing more water quality problems. Personal consumption, that's a big one. If you're pulling out lots of your product to give as samples to chefs or to restaurants or whoever, write it down because that can add up over time. Or I've got shellfish sample data here, but that could also be fingerling sample data or sample data of the fish or whatever else you're growing to see how they're growing throughout the year to make sure nothing's going wrong. So I've got just a quick example record sheet here for, say, an oyster farm or a mussel or clams or something like that, where May 1st, we stocked 150,000 baby oysters. We measured our dissolved oxygen. We checked the salinity. We put it into quadrant 1 or field 1 or whatever. In June, we pulled some out and we sent them off for disease testing. We probably should have written down which area those came out of, whether it was quadrant 1 or 2 or 4. And then the next month, we put another 150,000 baby oysters in this particular quadrant 2. In August, we harvested 10,000 oysters. We took the water quality information and where we sold them to, where those were going to. And all this can be very helpful with your production to figure out what you've got at any one time, knowing which pond different size animals are in, where to harvest from. Uh, if you stocked a bunch of animals and they died, but you didn't take the oxygen level in the water, was it the oxygen or did you get a bad set of animals from the hatchery? Did something happen? If everything's good on your end, maybe it wasn't your ponds or something you did. Maybe you got a bad set of animals. So it's very important to keep good records in that sense. And then we've got financial records. So sales records, the total number of animals that you've raised and sold, and whether you do it by the pound, by the each, by the bushel, the price you received, who you sold it from, what form was it in? Well, did you head off macrobrachium, whole macrobrachium, frozen, boxed on ice, shelled product, shuck product, whatever it is? Write it down. And then that way you can keep track of when that person pays you, which is always a good thing in your business, is to get paid for your product. Also keep track of your cost of your supplies, seed, electricity, utilities, fuel, how much you pay for each production input. Because if you don't know how much your supplies cost, there is no way that you can figure out what your cost of production is to know if you're making any money. I did some of these workshops in Myanmar and Southeast Asia a few years ago. They were recording the cost of their feed, but they did not record the transportation or delivery costs. So they had an idea of what their feed were costing them for fish, but they didn't have the true cost of feed because they weren't including the delivery charges. So it's little things like that. I always say, if you can spend money on it, write it down. And then keep track of your labor. You have paid labor. It could be the hours, the payment rate for each person. You could have unpaid labor. You should estimate an hourly cost for that. Should you have to go out and replace that person and hire someone, you know what kind of impact that would have on your business. If you trade someone fish or oysters for work, that is still a cost that you should keep track of. And from what I learned from our accountant last night, in the U.S., the IRS is very particular on what they call an employee. So I would talk with your accountant to make sure you got all your ducks in a row, all the paperwork that you should have, and all the records that you could have, so that you don't get into any trouble should you get audited by the IRS. If you have equipment purchases, you know what type of equipment it costs, the loan information, and this is another big one when it comes to your taxes. The percentage of time is devoted to farm work. So you need to keep a log if you use your pickup truck for work and for personal use. If you don't, even if it's 100% farm use and you don't have that log, the IRS will only allow you to claim 75% of the cost associated with operating that vehicle for the farm, unless you have a log that shows it's 100%. And you should also estimate the useful life of your equipment. There may be certain standard useful lives for equipment that you should talk with your accountant about. And this will be helpful when it comes to calculating depreciation, which we'll talk about shortly. So financial records, like I said, loan and rent payments. If you've got a mortgage on the farm or a loan on the farm, or you're renting dock space, those types of things, the principal amount, the interest amount, who you paid, the date, your loan balance, and a receipt number. Sometimes receipts get lost, checks get lost in the mail, somebody forgets to write something down. The more records you have to back up your side of what's going on, the better off you'll be. And then tax payments, sales tax, income tax, property tax, the amount you paid, when you paid it, who you paid it to, all of those types of information can be very important. So, like I said, why do we need to collect so many records? So you're going to take all these records, and that's what you use to figure out your financial position of your business, profitability of your business, the cost of your production. If you don't know your cost of production, how do you figure out a sales price that's going to make you some money? And then it can help you figure out market demand also. So different costs associated with aquaculture. This is when we go into a little bit more detail on some of the definitions of some of these costs and what category they would go into on, say, an income statement or enterprise budget. Some of it will sound familiar from previous section on record keeping. That's okay because it's important to know. So variable costs. These are costs that are incurred as a direct result of your farming business. If you don't own an aquaculture farm, you're not buying catfish fingerlings or oyster seed. So that's a variable cost. They may increase or decrease as your production increases or decreasing. So the more fish you stock, the higher the variable costs go. And you might be able to allocate some of these costs to individual ponds or shellfish leases or particular tank operations if you've got more than one. Like your seed, you know where it goes. If you put shell down or fingerlings, you know where it goes. You know which place that or which lease that vessel was operating on. You know where people were working. But some production costs might need to be allocated to the whole operation as a whole. Fuel, because that vessel or that truck was everywhere. You bought a lot of fuel, you keep it in your tank. You don't keep track of where that thing goes every day. Electricity, if you've got 100 ponds, you probably don't want to deal with the hassle of having 100 electric meters out there to monitor your paddle wheels or your pumps or whatever's going on. And then some types of labor. So when the guy's mowing all the levees and the dikes and around the fences and that kind of thing. That's kind of allocated to the whole operation. So tracking some variable cost. It's just a simple spreadsheet that I've put together here. So you have a date, a lease, a pond number, or a farm, or a tank number, the item that it is, how many, how much they cost per unit, and the total cost. So you can keep track of all this and add them up at the end of the year to figure out how much money you ended up spending. So there's seed or fingerling costs. You have a choice. You can buy seed or buy fingerlings, or you can produce your own. So when it comes to figuring out the cost of which is better, when you buy seed, it's the cost of the item and then delivery charge. If you're going to produce your own, you have costs associated with producing larvae, keeping brood stock, keeping small nursery ponds, the cost of and the technical ability and places to spawn the animals, transport them to wherever they need to go, and the time that it takes to do that with those animals. So you got to figure out which is worth your time and effort. Is it cheaper and easier to buy seed or buy fingerlings? Probably when you're starting out, it's a lot cheaper to buy seed or fingerlings than to produce your own. If you get to a point where you're so large you need that ability to do your own because you can't get what you need, that might be the time to start looking into that side of the business. Okay, electricity. You've got pumps, you've got aerators, you've got heaters for water in tanks sometimes, you've got equipment to handle nets and tumblers and washers and fingerlings, lights, other equipment. Electricity really adds up. You might can find other ways to reduce your electricity costs, such as looking at solar options or wind options, depending on where you're at. Lots of times you can find grants to help you put in these types of items to help reduce your electricity cost. I've had some growers tell me that they spend $200 a month on electricity for an oyster operation. And I've had some people tell me they spend $5,000 a month on electricity because the pumps they're running, the coolers they're running, the freezers they're running, the equipment they're running. So it can really add up, and you need to make sure you're paying attention to it. And if you've got a pump that's not being very efficient or a tank aerator that's not being very efficient, maybe you can look into a different piece of equipment to help lower that cost. And then fuel. You've got tractors, you've got aerators, you've got trucks, you've got boats, pumps, generators, other types of equipment. Fuel really adds up. If you see that fuel prices are going to go down and you've got the ability to store fuel on your farm, it might be a good idea to buy when the price is low. If you see something going on in the world that you think fuel prices are going to go up really high, maybe buy it now and hope that fuel prices don't go up. Or if fuel prices go up high, you've insulated yourself against that cost a little bit. And then labor. You might have full-time labor, part-time labor, seasonal labor, family labor, your own labor. Don't forget to pay yourself. So all types of labor should be considered, whether they are paid or not. And that's because if you have to go out and hire somebody, it's going to be a cost. So you should estimate how much that unpaid labor would cost you should you need to go out and hire someone. And exchanging goods and services for labor is still a cost. So estimate a cost of those goods or those services you've exchanged so you can get an accurate representation of what it costs to produce your product. And then there's maintenance costs. Everything breaks down at some point. So you're going to have to repair something. You're going to have to change the oil and the other fluids in your trucks and your tractors. You're going to have to lube up aerators. The weed whacker is going to die eventually. You're going to have to buy a new one. Everything breaks or needs to be maintained to keep it operational and keep it working. Could be like this picture where a hurricane came through, that kind of, or a big tropical storm. That really messes things up when you're out in the water. And also the cost to maintain buildings and structures. Every building probably needs a coat of paint every once in a while. The doorknob breaks, something like that. The light switch breaks. Eventually something's going to need to be maintained on everything. So all these are types of variable costs. So now we're going to talk about fixed costs. Fixed costs don't change with your production. So it doesn't matter if you produce one catfish or 1,000,000 catfish, you still have to pay the same loan amount to back to the bank. So things like loan payments, lease payments, licensing fees, those types of things tend to be fairly consistent over time, and don't change a whole lot. So therefore they're fixed. So like I said, lease and rent payments. So you might have a shellfish lease. You might have to rent a dock. You might be renting the farm that you're on. You might be renting ponds on somebody else's farm. Do you have government fees? Do you have loan payments? Do you have equipment payments or land and buildings? Depreciation, which depreciation is a non-cash expense, and it helps you. It's the value that your equipment or property loses due to age. So like when you buy a new car for $10,000 and then you drive it off the lot and you drive it back on 5 days later and it's not at CarMax and you change your mind, they don't give you back what you paid for it. It is depreciated in value. And you may have capital or investment costs that you would need to figure out. Purchases used to expand your building. Do you need to borrow money for large pieces of equipment? Do you need more land to make your business grow or to make things go a little easier? Construction materials. All these types are costs that you've invested back into your business that you have to spend. So I mentioned depreciation, and that's a big one because it doesn't show up in your checkbook, but eventually it's going to catch up with you. So it's the annual devaluation of equipment over time, and it's a non-cash expense. And the way I like to think about it is it helps you show how much you may need for replacement. Now, I used to give a quick depreciation example, but after I met with our accountant at our workshop last night, he told me there are about 9 different ways to calculate depreciation. So from now on, my example is to consult with your tax accountant for the best way for your business to account for the depreciation before you make that big purchase. He told me an example of there was a farm that they were taking $150,000 of depreciation for a piece of equipment every year for 7 years. When that 8th year came, nothing changed, but he had $150,000 less in profit that year just from no longer being able to write off that depreciation. So it can be a biggie. It can jump up on you, and you need to plan for it. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about predicting sales and marketing. So when you go to business school, they tell you that there are the 4 P's of marketing. But I have learned there are actually the 5 P's of marketing. So the first is your product, which is what you're producing. Your place, which is kind of like where you're at, where you're going with it, what are you going to sell, where you're going to sell it at. The price you're going to sell it at, and they stop at promotion, which is how are you going to let people know about your business. But when it comes to aquaculture, there's this big 5th one called politics that could often be larger than the whole rest of it. So let's just use oysters for an example. The market is going gangbusters for oysters right now, but it's difficult to find a good place to grow oysters. You can't grow oysters everywhere. You can't grow them in closed waters because they'll make people sick if they eat them. So it's not really a political issue, but that's the politics and where those lines are set. Um, Help you or would be part of politics. Or when if you want to ship product overseas. So if you want to ship oysters to the EU, I don't think you can do that from the US right now because there's some political discrepancies going on. So if you want to ship internationally or maybe to a different state, say you're growing tilapia fingerlings and you want to ship tilapia fingerlings to a different state, well, you have to deal with the rules from the other state to be able to even drive through it before you get to where you're going. Let's use grass carp for example. They produce a lot of grass carp in Arkansas and some other places in the state. Well, if you drive through South Carolina, they're going to want to stop your truck at the border to make sure that you only have grass carp and not something you're not supposed to have, and then make sure that they're not going to get out in the wild and reproduce or anything. So that's a extra step and extra time and extra cost that you have to deal with for traveling grass carp through the state of South Carolina. There may be other issues like that when it comes to aquaculture and what you're wanting to grow or what you're wanting to produce. And it really comes into play if you are transporting live animals. That's when it gets a little bit tricky. So when you go to sell your product, there's a couple of different routes you can go. You can go wholesale to like a distributor or to a processor, and you can go direct to consumer, or you might go direct to retail or restaurant sales. So if you're going direct to your consumer or direct to restaurant sales, there may be additional licenses that are required, especially when it comes to shellfish, to be able to ship and sell to these folks versus going directly to a processor or a wholesaler. I had one wholesaler tell me that restaurants tend to be fairly notorious for being late on payments. Would you rather get one check from him or have to chase down 8 or 9 different payments and spend your time doing that? So there's some key components of looking at your marketing. Look at your competition. You know, fish is a worldwide business. You might be growing them in Maryland or Arizona or somewhere like that, but your competition is everywhere. I have a grower in Maryland who can get an harvest an oyster today that will be sold for lunch tomorrow in Los Angeles. You can get anything in the world in 2 days. So your competition is everywhere. Think about a brand, and then also try to write a plan and put down your marketing ideas to make sure everything makes sense. So a couple more topics on marketing and sales. Good marketing can help you generate sales. However, high sales volume does not mean your marketing is good. You know, if you sell 100,000 pounds of catfish to the processor, have you really done any marketing, or did you just go to the processor? You know, there's a big difference. So sales. If this was a live audience with interaction, I would have asked you this question before I showed you the slide. But the only way to make money in aquaculture is to sell your product. If you're not making money, you have an expensive hobby, and you should sell your product for more than it costs to produce it. And how do we figure that out? From all of that record keeping that we've had. So if you can't sell it, you just got a hobby. If you're losing money, you've got a hobby. You need to sell it for a profit to be a successful commercial venture. So then, all right, so my sales, how do I know how to figure that out? Well, you can look at your past sales history, how much was sold, what sizes were sold, what price did they sell, are there different types of different times of the year that you have better sales than others, who bought your products. Getting customer feedback is critical for good decisions. They'll let you know if something's wrong. You know, an unhappy customer tells 5 people, a happy customer tells 1. You know, so Actually, nowadays, an unhappy customer tells the world on Twitter. So if you can figure out what's wrong, or if there's something that's not quite right, it can help you, and you can make a change. It can help you in the future. So sales, people often ask, well, how do I figure that out? Well, you can look at market trends from other industries, or not other industries, but other producers, and talk to them, know what's going on. Um, if you can figure out sales trends, you can help you plan your production, so that when you might be harvesting when prices are better. And people used to say, well, Matt, I'm not in business. How do I know how sales and things are going? Well, you can look at harvest records. You can call around. If you're dealing with shellfish, those harvests have to be reported. So here in Maryland, I put together a graph of bottom culture, aquaculture, oyster harvest by month for the last several years. And what you can see is there is a steep increase in sales in March, and then it trickles down a little bit, and then there's a little bit more of a bump um, towards the end of the summer, and then it goes down to almost zero sales almost every single year from October until March again. Well, from October to March is when the wild oyster season in Maryland for commercial harvest is open. So the bottom culture guys the last few years, haven't been selling a lot of product in the winter, fall and winter, because that's when the price was lower because of all the wild product that was on the market. So once the wild product went away, the prices went back up and they started selling product. So you can look at harvests if it's something like shellfish, um, or if there's a competing product. So if you're growing hybrid striped bass, you can look to see when the wild striped bass season is, to kind of get an idea of when things might have an impact on your price. You can also figure out supply and demand. Generally, as supply goes down, price goes up. As demand goes up, price goes up. It's kind of an inverse relationship. So by analyzing supply and demand, you can help plan your production for times of high demand, like the oyster farmers in Maryland have been doing. Take advantage of higher sales prices, which can help increase your profitability, and it also helps you better predict your cash flow. So now I have a couple of business planning resources that I threw in here at the end, since I saw a lot of people were interested in like writing business plans. So you can go or I recommend all of these services. I have used AgPlan before. It is a free online tool where you can write a business plan, and it has all the sections spit out. It's focused mostly on traditional agriculture. They also have a ag transition. So if you want to pass your farm down to your children or your grandchildren, a plan to help you do that smoothly, or if you want to go out of business, how to do that smoothly without being abrupt. In the last year or so, there's been one put up called fishbizplan.org, which focuses on the commercial fishing industry, but could be adapted to aquaculture very easily, and it is put together by the same people that did agplan.com. And those are put together by the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Farm Financial Management, I believe. It's really good products. You can also contact the Service Corps of Retired Executives. This is a small branch out of like the Small Business Administration, and it's retired executives or business people who volunteer their time to help businesses write business plans. And their website is www.score.org. And then also you can contact your university extension service. Every state in the United States has a land grant university that has an extension service with it. And I'm sure there's someone there that can help you with writing business plans. They may not be familiar with aquaculture, but they can still give you a lot of helpful hints when it comes to writing business plans. So here's my contact information. Should you have any questions down the line, I can help you out a little bit. Or if you're watching this at a later date and you had a question, feel free to shoot me a message, and I'll try to get back to you pretty quickly.